So hello everyone. As explained, my name is Kathleen St. George and I'm the archivist at the Royal Hospital for Neuro-disability, or the RHN for short, as we call it. It's my absolute pleasure to be doing this lecture for you this afternoon. And whilst waiting for the talk to begin, I'm hoping that you've been identifying the people in this first slide. There's no prizes for guessing either Charles Dickens or Florence Nightingale, I'm afraid. I'd be pretty impressed if you managed to identify the couple on the bottom left here, but all should be revealed later. So this talk is part of Wandsworth Heritage Festival, and the hospital is really proud to be involved again this year. The theme for this year's festival is Educating Wandsworth, which was a little bit of a tricky one for us to pull off, but we eventually decided on focusing on the individuals who mentored the hospital in its early years, many of whom were very public figures indeed, who we're still extremely honoured to be associated with. These individuals were the educators and social influencers of the 19th century who did much to campaign for the care and treatment of the poor and the suffering. I hope that you'll enjoy this very small tribute to them. But let's begin very briefly with the present. For those who aren't familiar with the hospital, I'll just give you a very quick overview. We are an independent medical charity established in 1854 that provides care for people with disabilities due to brain injury or neurological illness. The hospital is split between two main services. The first is the brain injury unit for people who need complex rehabilitation or for those with prolonged disorders of consciousness. And the second is a specialist nursing home for people with physical disabilities or cognitive behavioural needs. We have capacity of around 200 beds, and the vast majority of new admissions here are short-stay rehabilitation patients in the brain injury unit. But for starters, we can't possibly talk about our mentors without first addressing the main man, our founder, Reverend Andrew Reid. Now, Andrew Reid was originally an apprentice watchmaker, but he followed his calling to study theology, and he was ordained a congregational minister in 1811. He was also a very talented hymn writer, and he compiled a hymn book and published a number of sermons and books of devotion with the help of his wife, Elizabeth. He was also very skillful in forming a vast and influential social network that included, for example, the Duke of York, Angela Coutts, and Lord Grosvenor. But we'll cover a lot more on this later. So with the assistance of influential donors and supporters, Andrew Reid was able to achieve significant philanthropic success. He founded his first charity, the London Orphan Asylum, in 1813, which can be seen on the bottom left of this circular. This was followed by two further orphanages, a hospital for people with learning difficulties, a grammar school, as well as a savings bank. He was a truly extraordinary man who contributed many years' service to these charities, whilst also being a full-time minister to his church. The Royal Hospital for Incurables, which was the original name for this hospital and which was to be Andrew Reid's final venture, can be seen on the bottom right here. It is a testament to Reid that all but one of the charities shown here are still in existence. In the case of his earliest charities, that's over 200 years later. It is questionable, though, whether the hospital would have been set up at all were it not for this gentleman, the novelist Charles Dickens. We know, of course, that the 19th century was a time of great medical advancements. A lot of progress was being made in the prevention and treatment of infectious diseases, and mortality rates were declining through the adoption of antiseptic procedures and anaesthesia in operating theatres. However, there was very little improvement in the treatment and care of patients suffering from chronic disability. General hospitals were simply not willing to spare a bed where there was little or no hope of recovery, and sadly, such patients had to rely on the support and aid of their family and friends. In 1850, Charles Dickens actually wrote a short article admonishing the lack of care and facilities for people who were referred to in Victorian times as incurable. He wrote, "There are hospitals for the cure of every possible ailment or disease known to suffering humanity, but not one for the reception of persons past cure." In this very same article, Charles Dickens outlined a very affecting case report. The case of a poor servant girl, which lately came to our knowledge, is the case of thousands. She was afflicted with a disease to which the domestics of the middle classes especially are very liable: white swelling, probably tuberculosis, of the knee. On presenting herself at the hospitals, it was found that an operation would be certain death, and that, in short, being incurable, she could not be admitted. She had no relations, and crawling back to a miserable lodging, she lay helpless till her small savings were exhausted. Privations of the severest kind followed, and despite the assistance of some benevolent persons who learnt of her conditions when it was too late, she died a painful and wretched death. It is certainly no coincidence that the Royal Hospital for Incurables was established just 4 years after this article was written. So Charles Dickens continued to support the hospital after it was founded. He presided at the first 2 anniversary dinners, and his speech from the second dinner is on the left here. He also wrote letters to the board with recommendations about the hospital services and facilities. There are references to them in our minutes, but I'm very sorry to say that we don't have any of them within our archive. Although Dickens advocated on behalf of many institutions, let's now find out what inspired him to be so closely associated with ours. In order to understand his motivations, we need to go back to his childhood. Lord Shaftesbury, another philanthropist and social reformer, once said that God gave Charles Dickens a general retainer against all suffering and oppression. And it's easy to see why when we delve into his early years. Surprisingly, he actually had a rather promising start to life. He was born in Portsmouth at this house shown here, and the family then moved to Chatham in Kent. His father, John Dickens, was a clerk in the Navy Pay Office, which even afforded him a few years of private education. Charles spent a lot of time outdoors, but rather unsurprisingly, he was also an avid reader, with the Arabian Nights, Tom Jones, and Robinson Crusoe apparently being amongst his favourite books. Now, circumstances changed rather suddenly when John Dickens was recalled to the Navy Pay Office headquarters in London. The family left Kent with mounting debts, and as he was living beyond his means, his creditors forced John into the infamous Marshalsea debtors' prison. His wife and youngest children joined him there, as was the practice at the time. However, Charles, then only 12 years old, stayed with a family friend and spending Sundays at Marshalsea. To pay for his board and to assist his family, he was forced to leave school and work grueling 10-hour days at a blacking warehouse, where he earned 6 shillings a week, pasting labels on pots of boot polish. He later remembered his time at the warehouse in characteristically vivid Dickensian detail. It was a crazy, tumble-down, old house, abutting, of course, on the river, and literally overrun with rats. Its wainscoted rooms and its rotten floors and staircase, and the old grey rats swarming down in the cellars, and the sound of their squeaking and scuffling coming up the stairs at all times, and the dirt and decay of the place rise up visibly before me as if I were there again. The counting house was on the first floor, looking over the coal barges in the river. There was a recess in it in which I was to sit and work. My work was to cover the pots of paste blacking, first with a piece of oil paper and then with a piece of blue paper, to tie them round with a string, and then to clip the paper close and neat all round until it looked as smart as a pot of ointment from an apothecary shop. When a certain number of grosses of pots had attained this pitch of perfection, I was to paste on each a printed label, and then go on again with more pots. It was only when Charles's grandmother died and his father was left some money in her will that John was released from prison, and Charles was eventually able to return to school. So we can see that Charles Dickens's earliest associations were with poverty. The impressions stamped upon his young mind were of financial difficulties and miseries, as his family sank lower into debt. By the age of 20, however, he became increasingly self-confident. He knew he wanted fame, and as he enjoyed doing impressions and watching popular entertainment, he was drawn to the theatre. He was actually successful in landing an acting audition at Covent Garden, but ultimately missed out because of a cold. Before another opportunity arose, he faithfully set out on a career as a writer. Charles Dickens started contributing to a variety of journals, including the Morning Chronicle, which was edited by George Hogarth, whose daughter Catherine he actually ended up marrying. He made rapid progress both professionally and socially, rubbing shoulders with the likes of William Ainsworth, George Cruikshank, and Benjamin Disraeli. This led to a proposal from the publishers Chapman and Hall to supply text for a set of engraved illustrations. The resulting story became the famous The Pickwick Papers, which wasn't initially successful. But after the introduction of the humorous Cockney shoeshiner, Sam Weller, who no doubt sprang from Dickens's own early associations with the bootblacking trade, the book was transformed into a publishing phenomenon. It was eventually referred to as the most important single novel of the Victorian era. Charles Dickens' success as a novelist grew, but he essentially never forgot his roots. If we look at his writing, there is almost always an atmosphere of resentment at class consciousness and snobbery. There is also a pervading love for everything concerning the poor and the vulnerable. For example, in Martin Chuzzlewit, there is a passage that highlights his view of the less affluent and his diagnosis of their poverty. There are scores of thousands breathing now and breathing thick with painful toil, who have never lived at all, nor had a chance of life. Go ye, teachers of content and honest pride, into the mine, the mill, the forge, the squalid depths of deepest ignorance and uttermost abyss of man's neglect, and say, can any hopeful plant spring up in air so foul that it extinguishes the soul's bright torch as fast as it is kindled? Charles Dickens refused to see the poor as a class apart. He viewed that the fault of their condition lay not in them, but in bad laws, defective social arrangements, ineffective administration, and general neglect. And so he set to work and put to effect sweeping reforms in housing, education, and legal systems. Let's look at these all in turn. Charles Dickens urged that the issue of housing was paramount. In one of his speeches, he states, "The reform of the people's habitations must precede all other reforms. Without it, all other reforms must fail. Neither religion nor education will make any way until a government shall have discharged its first obligation and secured to the people homes instead of polluted dens." He also appealed to his readers. For example, in Little Dorrit, he berates a slum owner. "This fellow, fattening on the rents he grinds out of us poor courtiers, lives in a pleasant house at Highgate, a little gem of a cottage, where there is ivy and lilac and geranium, where the odours of hayrisk float in the air on golden wings, a little sweet-smelling eyrie on a high hill, which stands nodding familiarly to Hampstead. Does he ever think of Slaughterhouse Court, where the filthy houses he lets and persists in letting, and in conniving at subletting and in refusing to improve, so that they are so noisome, so infected, so hideous, that the swallows will not sit on the eaves to sun themselves, that the shrewd starlings avoid the place with a sidelong, cock-eyed glance of aversion? What live things could thrive in Slaughterhouse Court, save obscene rats?" It appears that when Charles Dickens spoke and wrote, people were awakened and they actually listened. In a few short years, the Association for Improving the Dwellings of the Poor was established. This was a forerunner of the Modern Housing Association, which sought to provide affordable housing for the working classes. It's also difficult to separate Charles Dickens' writing from children. Whilst other 19th century novelists largely excluded children from their works, his books are crowded with young characters from all walks of life, from the delicate Paul Dombey to the boisterous, artful Dodger here. And he certainly didn't shy away from observing the cruelties of an impoverished childhood, including the pains of hunger in Oliver Twist and the injustices of child labour in Nicholas Nickleby. Charles Dickens was fiercely critical of the indifference or mistreatment of children in the Victorian age. Whereas under the old system, children had been neglected and allowed to run wild, much like when Dickens himself picked up some crumbs of culture of his own accord. Schools then went the other way and became so mechanical and highly organised that they were equally ineffective. This style of instruction is perfectly illustrated in the figure of Mr. Gradgrind in Hard Times, and I'll try and put myself in character here. Now what I want is facts. Teach those boys and girls nothing but facts. You can only form the minds of reasoning animals upon facts. Nothing else will ever be of any service to them. The scene was a plain, bare, monotonous vault of a schoolroom, and the speaker's square forefinger emphasised his observations by underscoring every sentence with a line of the schoolmaster's sleeve. Charles Dickens' view of teaching involved developing their imaginations and not repressing their energies, and he was a frequent visitor to the first kindergarten in England. He also pushed for universal education and visited ragged schools which taught disadvantaged children until the government actually assumed responsibility for their education. He did much to discredit cramming and corporal punishment, and while schools for the poor were still overcrowded, they did become less badly built and lacking in trained teachers. One of the most controversial laws in Victorian times was the Poor Law Act of 1834, and Charles Dickens was a firm opponent. This poor law ensured that the needy were housed in workhouses, clothed and fed, and children would receive some schooling. In return for this care, workhouse paupers would have to work several hours each day. Many people, including Charles Dickens, considered workhouses to be little more than prisons for the poor, and riots even broke out about them in northern towns. To demonstrate how much the poor themselves hated and feared the workhouse, he used the voice of Betty Higden in Our Mutual Friend. "The poorhouse," said the secretary, "you dislike the mention of it?" "Dislike the mention of it," answered the old woman. "Kill me sooner than take me there. Throw this pretty child under cart horses' feet in a loaded wagon sooner than take me there. Come to us and find us all a-dying, and set a light to us all where we lie, and let us all blaze away with the house into a heap of cinders sooner than move a corpse of us there." Also, who can forget when Oliver Twist notoriously asked for more than his measly portion of gruel at the workhouse? Another issue that attracted Charles Dickens' attention was the abolishment of the system through which people suffered imprisonment for the apparent crime of owing money. Sadly, in Victorian England, falling into debt was seen as a moral as much as an economic failure. It was more difficult for the poor to obtain credit, bankruptcy was limited to the merchant classes, and ultimately about 10,000 people each year were imprisoned for debt during the course of the 19th century. Dickens was, of course, no stranger to debtors' prisons through the unfortunate circumstances of his father, and he worked tirelessly against the just and wholesome law, somewhat sarcastic of course, which declares that the sturdy felon shall be fed and clothed, and that the penniless debtor shall be left to die of starvation and nakedness. The Debtors Act of 1869, which significantly reduced the ability of the courts to detain those in debt, can be viewed one of his greatest victories in social reform. So, Charles Dickens' novels were, probably above all else, works of social commentary that investigated and revealed hidden truths. As the actor Simon Callow once said, he spoke on behalf of the people, and the people loved him for it. But aside from his novels, he also did a lot of direct campaigning, both in his public speeches and in his journal, Household Words, seen here. Household Words was a weekly magazine published from 1850 to 1859, which championed the working classes but addressed itself directly to the middle classes. In his novels, he was more of an objective observer, but in Household Words, he was a consciously biased journalist, which gave his writing even more power. The article, No Hospital for Incurables, which helped to establish the Royal Hospital for Incurables, was from this very magazine. But Dickens was also an active philanthropist, much like our own founder, Andrew Reed. For example, it's not common knowledge that he spent more than a decade founding Urania Cottage, which was a safe house for young women who were taken from lives of crime and prostitution, and they were trained for purposeful employment. Now, another area that's less associated with Charles Dickens, but it's of particular relevance to the hospital, is his impact on medicine. Notably, he supported the establishment of Great Ormond Street Hospital, the first institution to offer inpatient paediatric care to children. But, but it's interesting and quite unusual for someone with no clinical qualifications that his obituary appeared in both the British Medical Journal and the Lancet. Both journals highlighted his incredible talent at describing medical conditions, and contemporary doctors are still amazed that he often wrote about these conditions long before science fully understood them. Probably the most famous example of a Dickensian diagnosis is Joe in the Pickwick Papers. Joe's obesity, ruddy complexion, and excessive daytime sleepiness prompted the term Pickwickian syndrome to describe similar cases, but this has now been superseded by obstructive sleep apnea. In Bleak House, we possibly see the first written description of dyslexia about 30 years before the term reached medical literature, when we read that Mr. Crook, he can make all the letters separately and he knows most of them separately when he sees them, but he can't put them together. In David Copperfield, we encounter the kindly Miss Moucher, who is affected by dwarfism, and who can possibly forget the angelic Tiny Tim in A Christmas Carol, whose heartbreakingly small and sickly frame that needed the use of crutches may have been the result of tuberculosis or rickets. Charles Dickens continually presents his readers with the humanity of the ill and the disabled, and he shows us that they must not be shunned, but accepted and helped. In his final years, Charles Dickens suffered what is now thought to be a series of strokes, resulting in loss of vision, altered sensation on his left side, dizziness and pain. He was also thought to have suffered from neuralgia and childhood epilepsy. So he was familiar with neurological symptoms, and they were especially prominent in his work. Grandfather Smallweed in Bleak House, who needs to be carried everywhere and sat up at frequent intervals, may have had a spinal cord injury or muscular dystrophy. Frederick Dorrit, who turns in a slow, stiff, stooping manner and speaks with a weak and quavering voice, suggests Parkinson's. Cousin Phoenix in Dombey and Son, who is described as meaning to go in a straight line but turning off sideways by reason of his willful legs, has been diagnosed as having an ataxic gait. And also many characters in his novels are afflicted with seizures, including Josiah Bounderby in Hard Times, who suddenly dies after a fit. It's not exactly known whether Charles Dickens had any particular interest in the workings of the brain, though he did attend public demonstrations of mesmerism that were very popular at the time, mesmerism being a potential cure for epilepsy. Unfortunately, his exceptional observational and descriptive powers didn't bring him a long and comfortable life, as Dickens died at the relatively young age of 58. But his insights and activism created public health measures that contributed hugely to the well-being of others, not least those with chronic disabilities, through his support of our Royal Hospital for Incurables. So we're going to change tack a bit now as we're going to focus on another of our Victorian mentors, Florence Nightingale. Now, Florence Nightingale actually advised us on the recruitment of one of our matrons, and she also made some suggestions on the design of a proposed new site for the hospital. As you can see from this very flattering quote, she was a huge advocate of our work. So during 1861 and 1881, she wrote to the hospital on 7 different occasions, and these handwritten letters are the absolute treasures of our archive collections. Here is one of the letters to our board member, Dr. Balfour, in 1881, where she recommends a matron to us whom she refers to as Madame Lineker. Miss Lineker was trained at her Nurses Training Institute in Dublin, and the school found her a role as superintendent of Sir Patrick Dunn's Hospital. When the board reached out to Florence Nightingale for any suggestions as to the important role of matron at the hospital, she put Miss Lineker's name forward. And with such a recommendation, it's absolutely no surprise that we ended up appointing her to the position. It ended up being a very successful appointment, as Miss Lineker was matron of the hospital for a total of 21 years. Our House Committee minutes tell us that her starting salary was £200 a year, and when she retired in March 1902 at almost 70 years old, she was granted a pension of £150 a year. Now, 20 years earlier, Florence Nightingale wrote to our secretary, Frederick Andrew, for advice on a proposed new site for the hospital in Coulsdon in Surrey. Although the site was favoured by our founder, Andrew Reid, the move was never actually realised, as we ended up purchasing our current premises. However, we can see in the letters shown here that Florence Nightingale was impressed with Andrew Reid's proposal. In the extract on the right, she says, "Your site is well chosen. The gravelly soil about Croydon is good, but it requires to be very carefully drained and for your hospital to be well raised." She also provided us with recommendations on the design of the future hospital. In the extract on the left, she gives very specific measurements on the amounts of cubic space per patient, depending on whether it's a single room, shared room, or a day room. Of course, all of us have an image of the lady with the lamp and her work in the Crimean War. What is less well known is what actually inspired her to be one of the most acclaimed nurses of the Victorian era, even up to the present day. Also, what occupied her time when she returned from the battlefields of Scutari, including sharing her very valued advice with us. So we're going to go back in time again to find out. Unlike Charles Dickens, Florence Nightingale was born into a wealthy and well-connected family in the Italian city of Florence, from which she took her name. Within a year of her birth, her parents moved back to England, and Florence and her sister were raised in the family homes in Embley Park in Hampshire and Lea Hurst in Derbyshire. They received a solid education in history, maths, Italian, classical literature, and philosophy. And from an early age, Florence displayed a talent for collecting and analysing data. Her caring nature and predisposition for nursing the sick was evident since she was very young, as even her little dolls were properly bandaged if their limbs became broken or if sawdust started leaking out of their bodies, which is such a wonderful image. When she was a bit older, Florence became accustomed to dressing the wounds of those who were hurt in the lead mines and quarries of her Derbyshire home. She also went on visits to farm cottages with the local clergyman who had studied medicine as a young man, and through which she witnessed him advising people when they were ill or had had an accident. On one of these visits, she came across a sheepdog named Cap, who had an injured paw after some mischievous boys had started throwing rocks at him. This sheepdog was effectively Florence Nightingale's first ever patient, as she calmly but skillfully nursed him back to full health. Despite her privileged upbringing, she saw these early experiences as a sign from God, telling her to devote her life to healing others. After settling on her vocation, Florence Nightingale spent many years studying before she considered herself qualified to take on the role of nursing. Between 1849 and 1850, at around the age of 30, she spent some time at the hospital at Kaiserwerth in Germany. This institution was under the care of a Protestant sisterhood who cared for the poor and the sick, both at the hospital and within the community, to a degree that was unknown in any other part of Europe at the time. She also visited similar institutions in other parts of Germany, as well as France and Italy. When she returned to England in 1853, she took on the post of superintendent at the Institute for the Care of Sick Gentlemen in Harley Street, which is now the Nightingale Hospital. It was originally a nursing home for governesses which had fallen into a state of disorder through mismanagement. She stayed here for just over a year, and in that time she completely transformed its domestic, financial and sanitary affairs. But then, in early 1854, the Crimean War broke out when Britain and France entered the war against Russia on the side of the Ottoman Empire. It was when news of the terrible conditions suffered by the British wounded reached England that Florence Nightingale's work truly began. So on the left is an actual eyewitness description from the British base at Balaclava, which I won't read out as it's quite harrowing, even though it's edited down. In fairness, it's thought that the field surgeons did a credible job of treating war wounds through amputations or debridement. Unfortunately, the war occurred about 20 years before germ theory was fully developed and a whole century before antibiotics were available. And doctors had very few remedies with which to treat infectious disease. So when soldiers were packed onto transport ships in squalid conditions to be ferried across the Black Sea to the military hospital in Scutari, many did not survive the journey. In fact, a total of 47 out of 130 patients were said to have died during the 13-day transit from Balaclava to Scutari, just on one ship alone. It was in this environment and under considerable political pressure that the Minister of War, Sidney Herbert, who was a close personal friend of Florence Nightingale's, appealed to her to lead a team of nurses to the Crimea. As such, in November 1854, as this painting on the right so beautifully illustrates, she found herself, along with 38 other volunteer nurses, outside the barracks hospital in Scutari. The measures that Florence Nightingale put in place now seem mostly common sense, although they were considered at the time to be quite revolutionary. She and her nurses washed and bathed the soldiers, they laundered their linen, they gave them clean beds to lie in and fed them, all while working to improve the overall hygiene of the wards. She helped establish a rational system for receiving and triaging the injured soldiers. As they disembarked, they were stripped of their blood-soaked uniforms and their wounds were cleaned. To prevent cross-contamination, Florence Nightingale insisted that a fresh cloth be used for each soldier, rather than the same cloth for multiple patients. She arranged for new windows that could be opened to be installed in order to air out the wards. She also set up a separate kitchen, which was funded by herself, to prepare soups, broths, jellies, and other easily digestible foods to supplement the army's small rations. And in response to the petty corruption that was siphoning off the medical supplies, she established an alternative method for the delivery of critical materials and food. And finally, she kept meticulous records of everything that she did. In March 1855, she called for the Sanitary Commission to be sent to Scutari in order to flush out the sewers and improve ventilation. As a result of all these efforts, it's estimated that Florence Nightingale reduced the overall death rate of the British soldiers from a staggering 42% to just 2%. She was hailed a hero back in England, and she was completely revered by the sick and the wounded at the barracks hospital, some of who had never been nursed by women before. Her self-devotion, her appeasing manner, and a steady nerve elicited a lot of admiration and respect from the men. And this is summed up wonderfully in the poem Santa Filomena by the American poet Henry Longfellow. This is where the popular image of the Lady in the Lamp was first evoked. Florence Nightingale suffered a serious fever in the spring of 1855, but she didn't leave the Crimea until the last of the British soldiers were on their way home. On her return to England, she was entertained at Balmoral, and Queen Victoria presented her with the jewel seen here in commemoration of her services during the war. She was also gifted £44,000, which is the equivalent of around £2 million today, through the Nightingale Fund. This money was raised via public donations, and Florence Nightingale used it to set up the first nursing school at St Thomas's Hospital and a midwifery school at King's College Hospital. However, many people are unaware of the physical toll that her exhausting labours in the Crimea took upon her health. From 1857 onwards, she was frequently bedridden and suffered from depression, with brucellosis and associated spondylitis thought to be the cause. But despite her symptoms, she remained incredibly productive. In 1859, she wrote her Notes on Nursing, which served as a cornerstone of the curriculum at her nursing schools, though it was actually written specifically for those nursing at home. She said, "Everyday sanitary knowledge, or the knowledge of nursing, or in other words, of how to put the constitution in such a state as that it will have no disease, or that it can recover from disease, takes a higher place. It is recognized as the knowledge which everyone ought to have, distinct from medical knowledge, which only a profession can have. Several governments sought her advice on the sanitation of army camps, and she was also instrumental in the foundation of the British Red Cross, to name just a few of her endeavours." In fact, Florence Nightingale did some of her most pioneering work during her bedridden years, and we may take a closer look at some of her achievements in the latter stages of her career. Above all, Florence Nightingale is often cited as the mother of modern nursing. By creating the first training programme for nurses, she raised the image of nursing from a low-class job to a noble vocation. In the first half of the 19th century, nurses were usually former servants or widows who found no other work and who were forced to earn their living through nursing. Our old friend Charles Dickens caricatured nurses of the pre-Nightingale era in his novel Martin Chuzzlewit through the figure of Sairey Camp, who was portrayed as an incompetent, negligent, and rather corrupt alcoholic. But Florence Nightingale transformed this stereotype partly by doing away with the notion that all paid work was degrading to a woman's gentility, and partly by reinforcing that caring for the sick could not be undertaken without any special teaching or preparation for it. She argued that no man ever attempted responsible work as a doctor, lawyer, or engineer without spending a number of years making himself fit for it. She said, "Nursing it as an art, and if it is to be made an art, requires as exclusive a devotion, as hard a preparation as any painter's or sculptor's work. For what is the having to do with dead canvas or cold marble compared with having to do with the living body, the temple of God's Spirit?" One of Florence Nightingale's main achievements was the introduction of trained nurses into the workhouse system from the 1860s onwards. And by the early 1880s, Nightingale nurses had become matrons at several hospitals throughout the country, including, of course, our very own Royal Hospital for Incurables. Another strong area of influence of Florence Nightingale's is hospital infection control. Although she can't claim sole credit for sanitary theories, the impact of her reforms in Scutari was so well publicised miasmas, or Philou Pasteur and Joseph Lister. She urged, "In the present so-called enlightened time, sound principles of hygiene are by no means widely spread, even among the civil medical profession. To this circumstance, it appears mainly to be owing that the belief in contagion as an unavoidable cause of death from epidemic disease is still so prevalent." In effect, many of our current healthcare procedures, such as isolation of patients, avoidance of cross-contamination, routine cleansing of patient areas, aseptic preparation of foods, ventilation of wards, and disposal of medical waste, trace their origins to methods employed by Florence Nightingale at Scutari. And there's surely been a resurgence of these practices during COVID. And it was in fact a nod to her that the temporary critical care facilities that were set up during the pandemic were called NHS Nightingale hospitals. An offshoot of infection control is epidemiology, and Florence Nightingale's early interest in statistics as a young girl, mentioned earlier, came in really useful on her return from the Crimea. When she left for Scutari, she believed that inadequate food and supplies were the problem. But when mortality rates began to fall significantly only after the Sanitary Commission arrived, she realised that lack of sanitation had been the main cause of the death. Florence Nightingale resolved to present her findings to non-specialist audiences, such as Queen Victoria, politicians and bureaucrats, but she feared that their eyes would simply glaze over at her long list of numbers. So she devised ways to make the data more interesting, and her circular graph shown here, known as the Florence Rose or polar area diagram, it's basically an early version of the pie chart, was the result. As seen on this graph, when comparing the deaths with deaths from in 1858, Florence Nightingale became the first female member of the Royal Statistical Society, and it can be argued that modern healthcare owes as much to her use of statistics as it does to her nursing of the sick. Last but not least, Florence Nightingale's major interest was centred around hospital design, which we have seen from the correspondence that we saw earlier, benefited us at the hospital greatly. She felt very strongly that hospital administrators and staff did not pay proper attention to the safety and efficiency of hospital buildings, and she was even more forceful about hospital architects. In a private letter to her brother-in-law, she exclaims, "I know no class of murderers who have killed so many people as hospital architects. At this moment, there are many diseases less fatal in the most wretched homes than in hospital." Her own designs became known as Nightingale wards, and the signature feature of these wards were large windows that prevented potentially hundreds of staff and patients being exposed to this exact same air. She influenced the design of the new St. Thomas's Hospital with its innovative pavilion style of 7 large separate buildings connected by walkways as seen on the right here. She was totally opposed to the corridor plan of hospital design and tells us so in no uncertain terms in one of her letters. I regret to see the word corridor used. A corridor, if it means a long room with windows on one side, can rarely be kept healthy. Although Florence Nightingale recommended windows to allow plenty of light and cross-ventilation, current research has now shown that natural light, fresh air, and views of nature can also reduce depression, pain, and stress during hospital stays. Contemporary hospitals have obviously evolved from their initial division into pavilions to single-block buildings, but the Nightingale designs have had a huge impact on our current generation of hospital buildings being clinically effective. Florence Nightingale apparently only consulted on the design of 16 civil hospitals within the UK, so it is indeed an honour that one of these hospitals was the Royal Hospital for Incurables. Okay, so now I'm going to touch on one or two other well-known Victorians who mentored the hospital and who were in particular of big assistance to Andrew Reid in setting up his various charities. And there can be few more famous Victorians than the Prince Consort himself. Prince Albert was an influential contact of Andrew Reid, and he actually laid the foundation stone of the building for Reid's second charity, the Infant Orphan Asylum, in 1827. It was mainly due to his relationship with Prince Albert that the hospital was referred to as a royal hospital from the outset, particularly as Andrew Reid had received royal patronage for all his previous charities. However, after the untimely death of the prince in 1861, the hospital had to wait quite a long time to secure its royal designation. Prince Albert may not initially be an obvious supporter of Andrew Reid's charities, as he's perhaps most renowned for his enthusiasm for the arts, for science and commerce, which of course culminated in his illustrious Great Exhibition of 1851. This fair was a monumental celebration of culture and technology, and its motive was to advertise Britain's role as a successful leader in industry. However, he also held more philanthropic views. In a speech in 1848, he expressed sympathy and interest for that class of our community who have most of the toil and fewest of the enjoyments of this world. It is the duty of those who, under the blessings of divine providence, enjoy station, wealth, and education, and to assist those less fortunate than themselves. This philosophy is very much in alignment with Andrew Reid's, and Prince Albert was conducive in leading reforms in university education, in welfare and the royal finances, and he also supported the campaign against slavery. At this point, you may be wondering whether Prince Albert's wife supported the hospital. Well, the Queen wasn't opposed to the Royal Hospital for Incurables as such, and she even sent us some gifts, such as her leaves from the Journal of her life in the Highlands in 1868. However, she never granted a patronage to the hospital, and this seemed to be due to the name of the hospital and the fact that she wouldn't want to be associated with an institution where patients weren't cured. In a private letter between her private secretary and clerk marshal, it states that it is a false term to call it a hospital. In the usual acceptance of the word, it is an asylum. It seems also a cruel sentence upon a person to make it necessary for their admission into the asylum that they should be certified as incurable. Now, the term incurable was always a contentious one, and it wasn't dropped from our title until 1995. But it can also be said that it was a somewhat relative phrase, as can be seen with our very first patient, Julia Rolfe. As per the extract from our casebook on the left, Julia lived to over 80 years of age after being admitted to the hospital as an incurable a whole 50 years beforehand. This is not the end of the story regarding the patronage of the hospital, which I'll continue later, and you'll be pleased to know that it does have a positive outcome. But we shall now move on to someone who was referred to as one of Andrew Reid's most earnest advisors and supporters, the Duke of Wellington. Though the Duke died a few years before the foundation of the hospital, Andrew Reid must have consulted him about his new venture. The great respect that the Duke had for our founder was evident in his speech at the anniversary dinner of the London Orphan Asylum, which is high praise indeed from such a powerful man. He said, "I have not been to a public dinner for some years, and I have resolved that, as age and infirmities are creeping upon me, I would go no more. But I'm here tonight at the request of that great man whose wishes are to me law, and whose entreaties I felt as a command it was impossible to resist. Sorry about the sneezing in the background. I think my cat's suffering from hay fever. So again, the Duke of Wellington may not be the first name to spring to mind when speaking of humanitarian endeavours, especially considering his nickname, Iron Duke. He was quite a complex figure, both as a military commander and as a prime minister. He's widely regarded as one of the greatest military commanders of all time, and his tactics and battle plans are still studied in military academies around the world. Yet, when recalling his greatest victory at Waterloo, he was haunted by the huge loss of life. He wrote, "I hope to God that I have fought my last battle. Next to a battle lost, the greatest misery is a battle gained." He served twice as Prime Minister, and he experienced a lot of unpopularity for opposing the Reform Act of 1832, which would have given the vote to small landowners, tenant farmers, shopkeepers, and householders. However, on the other side of the coin, he enabled a degree of emancipation through his passing of the Catholic Relief Act of 1829, which allowed Catholics almost full civil rights in the UK. Moving on from the battlefields and the House of Commons now, we're going to return briefly to 19th century novelists with another of our Victorian mentors. Now, our fundraising appeals are still an important way for the hospital to raise vital funds, and from 1872 to the Second World War, our Christmas appeals were an annual event. These often took the form of personal appeals from high-profile figures, which were then circulated to our subscribers. Without doubt, one of the most famous celebrities to feature was Thomas Hardy. He contributed to the Christmas appeal from 1908, shown here, and he certainly makes a very lyrical but stirring plea when he writes, "To mind less is really to bear less, and comfort helps men to mind less. It is a fact to be remembered in respect of the Royal Hospital for the Incurables." Thomas Hardy's sympathies for the sufferings of others are probably very similar to Charles Dickens. Thomas Hardy was a realist writer who was critical of class structures and the conventions of late Victorian society, particularly those relating to marriage, education, and religion, that limited people's lives somewhat. He was writing a few decades after Dickens at a time of significant social change, when England was making its slow transition from an old-fashioned agricultural nation to a modern industrial one. Businessmen or new money joined the ranks of the social elite, while some of the aristocracy or old money faded into obscurity. His novels, such as Far from the Madding Crowd, The Mayor of Casterbridge, and Tess of the D'Urbervilles, he focuses on the declining status of people in rural villages in his semi-fictional region of Wessex, which is largely due to the increased forces of capitalism. Our final Victorian mentors are our mystery couple, who I pointed out earlier. They are Otto Goldschmidt and his wife, Jenny Lind. Now, Otto Goldschmidt was an accomplished pianist, and Jenny Lind was a renowned soprano, and together they gave concerts to raise funds for the hospital. In 1863, the Times reported that Mr. and Madame Goldschmidt had donated the proceeds of a concert held at St. James's Hall, which amounted to around 500 guineas. Sometimes the Goldschmidts were joined by Sir Squire Bancroft, also pictured here, who was a very well-known actor who would do readings of Dickens' A Christmas Carol. And he certainly looks a very dapper chap, doesn't he? Otto Goldschmidt had a very fine musical pedigree. He studied under Mendelssohn, and he also took private piano lessons with Chopin and Clara Schumann. He also came from a social activist background, as his mother was Johanna Goldschmidt, who was a campaigner for higher education for women in her native Germany. His wife, Jenny Lind, was an opera singer who was referred to as the Swedish Nightingale. I was a bit confused at first, but it obviously refers to her beautiful singing voice rather than any similarity to our Florence. It's rumoured that Hans Christian Andersen met and fell in love with her, and she had many other celebrity admirers, such as Robert Schumann and Berlioz. She also performed for Queen Victoria and other members of the royal family. In an incredible act of charity, she undertook a tour of 93 large-scale concerts in America, for which she earned $350,000, which is the equivalent of around $12 million today. She donated the entire proceeds to various causes, including free schools in her homeland of Sweden. After she settled in England with her husband in 1855, she retired from the opera and she only did very occasional concerts. So we're fortunate indeed to have had her come and perform for us at the hospital. Okay, earlier I mentioned the patronage of the Royal Hospital for Incurables and our unsuccessful application to Queen Victoria. Luckily, her son, who was to become King Edward VII, agreed to become the hospital's patron in 1880, and we've had unbroken royal patronage ever since. This includes the constant patronage of Queen Elizabeth II from 1952 until her passing last year. We've also been honoured with many royal visits. The Queen Mother visited us 4 times between 1924 and 1973, and Queen Elizabeth herself visited us 3 times between 1976 and 1989. Diana, Princess of Wales, opened our Andrew Reed ward in 1991, whilst our new king rededicated our restored assembly room in 1994. Our most recent royal visitor was Prince Edwin in 2010. Whilst this talk has focused on our mentors from the Victorian age, we've also received a lot of backing and assistance from high-profile figures in more recent times. Examples of post-Victorian mentors include the poet John Betjeman, who continued our support from the literary world by helping us raise over £5,000 in 1959. We've also had enduring support from the world of entertainment, including the celebrated magician David Devant, who published many books on magic, and he was the first president of the Magic Circle. David Devant performed for the hospital on many occasions, and he unfortunately subsequently became one of our patients in 1937. It is, of course, impossible to name all of the hospital supporters, past and present, famous and not so famous, but we do remain grateful to each and every one. Our work would, quite simply, not be possible without them. And this sadly brings me to the end of my talk, but please do feel free to send me an email, and please give the RHN Archive Service Twitter account a follow if you can. If there is an area of the hospital's history that you would like me to focus on in a future talk, then please do drop me a line. I'm very open to ideas. And if I've inspired you to visit us in person, then we'll be doing free tours of the building and grounds as part of Open Gardens this weekend. If that's too soon, then we'll also be participating in Open House in September. So we look forward to seeing you then, maybe. And now I'm very happy to take any questions.
Catherine, thank you so much. Yes, if anyone's got any questions, please do pop them in the Q&A tab. I've got questions. So you mentioned mesmerism. Could you go into just a little explanation of what that is exactly?
Yeah, I mentioned it because Dickens went to some public demonstrations, and his friend Dr. Elliotson, I think, practiced it. It's a kind of a precursor to galvanism, which is the idea that electricity can regenerate life. If you think of frogs' legs pulsating, all very Frankenstein. But mesmerism came a bit before that, and it's the idea that all living things have kind of like a magnetic fluid, and some practitioners, although they've more recently been discredited as quacks, claim that they could manipulate this magnetic field or fluid and generate things like heat, trembling, or even bring on full-on seizures. And when they reached a crisis point, the patient would then be healed of their particular conditions. I mean, it made a great show, and the Victorians did love a great show. They even went to operations and various gory things. So yeah, not for everyone. But there you go.
No, not for everyone, I'm sure. Just touching on Charles Dickens, how exactly did he help and support Great Ormond Street?
So he pretty much supported the hospital much like he did ours. It actually opened a few years before we did, I think in 1852. And it didn't initially receive a lot of credit as the first hospital specialising in paediatric inpatients, despite its important work. And Dickens actually wrote an article, much like he did with us, in his journal Household Words. And I think the main part of it that he's quoted that 1 in 3 babies died before their first birthday, which is an absolutely appalling statistics, even by Victorian standards. But it shocked people into taking notice. In fact, a few years later, it was doing so well that the hospital was running out of space. And then Dickens did some public readings for them, specifically passages relating to children, which is really lovely. And this apparently raised enough money for them to buy the building next door. So really helpful.
Oh, wonderful. Well, talking about fundraising, Elizabeth's asked a question: where do you get your present day funds from? What, the RHN?
Similar to what we used to do, we used to have a lot of public events, everything from afternoon teas to fundraising dinners. People do a lot of sporting events, everything from skydiving to walks along the river. Yeah, we have a very, very active fundraising department. You name it, we do it.
And Emma's asked, what was the impetus for the hospital finally changing its name in 1995?
I think it was an ongoing momentum to change it, but I think the main problem is that they couldn't find a better alternative to describe what we do. And it's really only in the 80s that we started to specialize in acquired brain injury and neurological conditions, you know, as diagnostics became better. And then it just made sense for it to be renamed to Royal Hospital for Neuro-disability. Before that there were other brief changes. It didn't go directly from the Royal Hospital for Incurables to the Royal Hospital for Neuro-disability. It was for a time called the Royal Hospital and Home, Putney. So there were, we did try and drop it before that because it was always so contentious.
Yes. So we've got a question from Sophie about Florence Nightingale. Did she ever visit the RHN?
Not to my knowledge, and this is probably to do with the fact that she was probably quite ill then. She did most of her work remotely. As far as we know, no, she didn't actually visit. And when she was writing to us, it was in the early days. Mostly about our new site in Coulsdon, which never actually happened. I'm not sure. She might have visited, if anything, the Coulsdon site, but looking at her letters, it was all remote advice. I don't think so, unfortunately.
I believe in the later years she wasn't very well, was she? She wrote a lot of letters from her bed, and sort of sent them out into the world. So she had quite a vast correspondence. Yes. How can, you have already touched this, but how can current sponsors support the hospital if they would like to?
Well, like I said, all the fundraising activities that we do, I would encourage people to look on our website. We have a special events website there that lists all the events that we have on. I believe we have an afternoon tea this week. We have some fundraising dinners, some parties, and then I think we're active again in various marathons and walks. But it's not my specialism, but it's all I would absolutely encourage people to look on our website. There's a dedicated site for all our fundraising activities.
Yeah, that's true. We've got a fundraising page, so do have a look there. Anyway, thank you. It's 2:00, so we should probably wrap up. This lecture has been recorded, so for anyone who's missed it, we'll have it up on YouTube by next week, so do check back then. Catherine, thank you so much for talking to us. It's been really
absolute pleasure.
Interesting. And thank you to all of you guys for joining us. And do join us for one of our other upcoming lectures. Have a look on our events page. We try and run them every month. So we hope you can join us again soon. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Hope to see you.